Welcome, my pod people. This is really a wonderful thing to share this episode with you with one of my teachers and all fellow author, Dr. Claudia Welch. Dr. Welch has been a lifelong student of life and medicine. She's practiced Ayurveda and worked in Eastern medicine education, and she's licensed as a doctor of Oriental medicine. So her book, Balance Your Hormones, Balance Your Life, Achieving Optimal Health and Wellness Through Ayurveda, Chinese Medicine, and Western Science, came out about 13 years ago and was really pivotal for me in beginning to understand hormones and also women's health at large. It's a fantastic resource. She's also the author of The Four Qualities of Effective Physicians, Practical Ayurvedic Wisdom for Modern Physicians, which is a great book for anyone who is working in the holistic health realm. And Dr. Welch has lectured internationally on Oriental medicine and Ayurveda for decades, exploring how Eastern medicine applies to women's health and today's reality in general. And we talk about both of those things in this episode. We get a deep dive from Claudia about HRT, hormone replacement therapy, which is probably one of the questions I get most often. So don't miss this episode where we get to hear from someone who's been following this conversation and the research on it, as well as working as a clinician in women's health for decades. So we hear from her about that. We also talk a bit about hormones and what affects them in our daily life. So stay tuned. Don't miss this. Dr. Claudia Welch is really one of the greats, I would say, in the fields of holistic medicine today. I'm so happy to share this with you. Welcome to Everyday Ayurveda with Kate, a podcast that translates ancient wisdom for modern lives. I'm your host, Kate O'Donnell. I've been living and teaching Ayurveda, India's traditional medicine, for over 25 years, and I've authored 4 best-selling books on bringing Ayurveda practices into our lives. If you're tired of battling digestive issues, hormonal imbalances, menopause symptoms, or are seeking a deeper spiritual connection and purpose, you're in the right place. This podcast is for you, offering practical, accessible advice to help you heal through diet, optimize your daily routines, and enhance your overall well-being. Follow this space for insights on a diet that heals, strategies for better digestion, sleep, hormone health, and direction for finding a deep sense of meaning and purpose. Join me, my pod people, for this empowering journey into self-care and self-discovery. Together, we'll explore how to bring balance and vitality into your everyday life. Let's do this. Thanks for being here today with us, Claudia.
Thank you for inviting me, Kate. Thanks
Yeah.
everybody else for being here too.
So I was thinking about your women's health book was published about 13 years ago. And that was my first introduction to sort of the conversation on women's health. And at the time I was in my early 30s, and it really struck me. You talked about sort of how hormones begin changing around the age of 35. And so I made really big changes in, I would say, my navigating principles at that time. Sort of moved from, I would say, external pursuits. And as I say, I sort of put on the apron around that time. I think I was 33. I put on the apron and kind of started focusing on nourishing myself and getting enough rest, and things like that, that really hadn't been on my radar previously. And so I think of your work as part of what got me on the journey that's gotten me to the place where I published the Everyday Ayurveda for Women's Health this year.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I'm curious how in 13 years, how have you seen the conversation change about women's health from Eastern perspectives?
Well, even though you're supposed to be answering the question, asking the questions, something that you just said makes me want to ask you a question. You started implementing these principles of rest and slow down, basically, and nourish, right? That's what the women's work that I've been doing my whole thing. That's the tagline. That's the bumper sticker, whatever I just said. I now can't remember what it was. So slow down, stop, whatever. Nourish, you were in your early 30s when you read the book and you started putting on the apron. And so be honest now at how old are you?
Almost
40,
46.
almost 46. Has that made your life a piece of cake?
No, it wasn't before either, but it's just changed the way that, like, what's important. It has changed
So
what's important.
I would suggest that when we do these things, when we slow down and when we nourish, it doesn't make life all of a sudden easy, and then it's easy street from there out. But where would you be right now without those tools? The impetus continues to be, and as far as I can see, and this is, we could say, ultimately depressing, but we could also just say it's just the way it is, and we have to be really awake to what is, which is that in these 13 years since that book was published, it wasn't the case that everybody read that book in the world and was like, oh, time to slow down and nourish ourselves and the planet, and now everything is so much better. What has not changed is kind of more impressive than what has changed, which is that there's still this incredible external pull to move externally, to have our attention be pulled out of our beings and attached to news and things and seductions and fears and all of these things that we lose our attention, which is the outer expression of the soul, as my guru used to say. So we lose our soul to these external expressions of reality, and our attachment is there. And it seems, if anything, to be much greater a pull as time goes on. And those efforts that you made in your early 30s when you read the book, and that I made, when I changed my life a lot in my early 30s and 35, because of knowing this stuff. And it's still, I have no idea where I would be right now if I didn't make every effort to prune away the unnecessary outer attachments. It's not to say that I've succeeded in all those areas and all those times, and that I haven't given in to any seduction that walks across or any fear that darkens my door. But all of the efforts make an enormous difference in my life. I believe in yours. I believe in anybody who's trying to do these putting on the apron changes in life, right? Okay, committing to the kitchen of nourishment, of universal divinity, right? Like, I am committed, right, to putting on that apron and nourishing myself and others when I can. Any effort towards that is, I think, so much more powerful than we know. And I know I'm going on, but there's something I want to say about this, I think, which is something that's occurred to me over the last X number of years, is how clear and obvious it is when one person is insane, emotionally, mentally, or physically imbalanced to a terrific degree. How clear it is the damage that one individual does. That's so clear. It ripples out to the family, to the community, to the however wide that community is. And you can see, oh my God, the chaos that person is wreaking, and the amount of effort and attention that you have to give to stabilize that situation is enormous. And I thought, well, God, how is it that one person who's imbalanced can make such a huge difference, but one person who's balanced doesn't seem to make so much difference in the world? We don't hear about that person who's just stable and feeding their family and feeding themselves and being good to each other. That doesn't seem to make so much of a difference. And I was kind of reflecting on that, and I thought it's a similar thing to these days. There's so many climate calamities, like in Vermont, where I live a lot of the time, that we're having these catastrophic floods on a yearly basis now. We now have like a monsoon, and it wipes out the roads, and everybody's talking about it, and it gets all this attention. And the tornadoes get the attention, and the fires get the attention, and these calamities draw our attention, and understandably so. But what's so much more important is that the sun rises and sets every day, and the moon still has its phases. and the air still blows and we still have it. I mean, these stable things that don't invite fanfare and don't invite a lot of our attention to be moving outwards, those are far more important ultimately than any of the calamities we've had, because it keeps us alive and keeps us going and keeps us nourished. And so that metaphor to me was like, oh, we don't necessarily see the ripple out effects of the sanity and the good health and balance of one person, but it must be there. It must be like the sun rising and setting. It's got to be there. And so all these efforts that you've made since you were in your early 30s, all the efforts that I've made, all the efforts that anybody makes towards putting on the apron in those moments, to me, I think those are the sun rising and setting moments. That's the stability. That's the core of the stability of the social fabric and natural fabric of this world.
I love that message. Sort of that the rest and nourish is the unsung hero in our story. And I also hear you saying, Claudia, that our attention is seduced by external things. Like it could be objects, like we want money or sex or food or news, current events, and the way that they're being presented to us are very alluring as well. So it is an answer to just kind of focus the mind more often on the unsung heroic moments in our days.
I think, and I would add that there's also fears. Our attention is being pulled towards the seductions and the fears, because there's things we're afraid of that take our attention every bit as much as the things that we're seduced by. And for me, it's not so much, I think the actions end up it being in line with that putting on the apron kind of activities, but more importantly than putting my attention there, the attention to me needs to go inside. I need to close my eyes
Mhm.
and bring my attention inside. That's where the real goods are. And it's from there that the sanity flows and the apron moments become real nourish. You know, you could put on an apron and cook all day long, and it could be in this codependent, needy kind of way that actually poisons everybody to a certain extent. It's not the actions as much as the motivation, the impetus, the core of those actions, you know, that seed of those actions, you know, from where the actions come from. And that from where place is the place to put attention, I think. And that's what, you know, why Ayurveda has dinacharya, so that in the morning we spend some time nourishing that inner terrain so that it then nourishes us, our well-being.
Mm.
That's not the only reason, but it's a good one.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I've heard you say uh, not so long ago was how your attention has, or your interests have changed, shifted from, I think around the time of you writing your women's health book, you were doing a lot of research, really focusing on a lot of numbers and the dance of the hormones and all these sort of aspects of the body, that these are the things I think in the space around health that we hear about, you know, top 3 things to do for perimenopause. And one of the things I heard you say was that you were starting to become more interested in the cause of the cause of the cause of the imbalances, which I think is what you were just saying, that the seed of our actions is actually that which creates the health or the non-health. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so as I'm getting older, I'm 55 now, and I am so much less interested in biological detail. I mean, I have to kind of keep up with that a little bit, but I'm so much less interested. When that book came out, and I'm sure you've heard me say this, but the editor, who I love and still love, Renee, she said, you know, I wrote the book and they were great. They didn't write the book. People complain about publishers changing their books so much that no, she was great. I wrote the book, but she wrote the title, and she came to me, or somebody there wrote the title, and she said, we have a great title. It's balance your hormones, balance your life. And I said, well, that's good, but it's backwards because that insinuates that if you balance your hormones, your life will balance. And the book is completely about the opposite. If you balance your life, your hormones will balance. And she said, well, that's great, but this will sell more copies. And I was like, fine, that's your job. You put the title on. And so now I forget my train of thought. There was,
But being less interested in biological
oh yeah, yeah.
detail.
So that's, people are interested in hormones, but nobody's really interested in hormones. People are interested in having a good life. So it's being less interested in biological detail is because over the years, more and more and more, it's become more and more clear to me that it's not about the hormones, it's about how we live our lives, and how we live our lives it is completely about our belief systems and what and our fears and our seductions. And so those are the causes. And so then why are we seduced by certain things? So then you go to the cause of that seduction and you kind of weed that out. Why am I afraid of certain things? You go to the root cause of that and weed it out. But when I say that, I don't necessarily mean talk therapy, like, oh, why am I afraid? Maybe this is because of my childhood, this or that. I'm not saying that's not a good idea, but what I generally do is not focus on the story about how that fear or seduction happened, but to kind of to just not feed it, to just in the morning try to do my meditation, which I suck at. I'm a terrible meditator. If anybody is like feeling second rate about their meditations, I'm right there with you, right? But it's the attempt. It's, the attempt. I'm so grateful to hit that pillow and to be able to keep trying in my, ridiculous little way to not feed the external focus and to feed that internal focus. And then the fears and the seductions, they don't always completely go away. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they just get a little bit more right-sized so that I can say, like there was that movie, A Beautiful Mind. I don't know if you remember that movie, but this incredible mathematician who had mental health issues would see these little people in his life and they would really run his life for a long time and they were hallucinations. And by the end of the movie, he still sees them. But, he'll say, Kate, do you see those two people in the corner of the room? And you'd say no. And he would say, okay, so I see you, but you're not running the show. And so the fears and the seductions, it's kind of like that. Okay, I see you, but you're not running the show. And so that ends up weeding out some of the fear, some of the entrapment feelings of life that increase adrenaline and cortisol. And when that happens, there's just no possibility of hormone balance. So it's just that to me is there's other reasons, there's environmental reasons that things go wrong and so forth, but this is a huge one and it's one we can do something about.
I feel like you hit it on the head when you said it's not about hormones, it's about how we live our lives. And I completely find that to be true also. In my personal experience, also my experience, as a teacher in community. So a lot of the conversation in this women's health space right now is moving towards the hormone replacement therapy, which I'm definitely not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I have a lot of friends who are reliant on hormone replacement therapy for symptoms that make life difficult to live. I think what worries me about the conversation is that we're not seeing any conversation about how we live our lives. So you just, again, as we do in a lot of the Western approach to imbalances, is we just take a pill. And so I've heard you in your book, this was a while ago now, so I'd love to hear if there's been changes in your viewpoint, but in your book, you sort of talk about hormone replacement therapy as a stopgap measure. So like while we're working on how we do life, we might be also using some sort of hormone replacement therapy. Is that what you'd say now?
So in the book, I actually say I would never recommend synthetic hormone replacement therapy, but that if we need a stopgap measure, I would recommend bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, which you can find at decent, compound pharmacies. So I ultimately stand by that. So here's the thing. This is going to take a few minutes to kind of give a little summary for people. This is the main overarching thing is that women were told pretty much across the board by their MDs up until 2002, if they were going through menopause, perimenopause, having these really hard symptoms, hot flashes, night sweats, mood swings, insomnia, all those kind of classical symptoms that often accompany menopause and perimenopause. They were told pretty much across the board, you need to get on HRT. Then the 2002 study came out and it had to be stopped. It had to be halted before it was completed because the risks were outweighing the benefits significantly. That's pretty huge. They don't usually stop a study. So that's pretty huge. So that was so powerful that overnight physicians were saying, only take the smallest amount, if you have to, for the shortest amount of time. Cut ahead, it's now been 22 years from that 2002, now we're 2024, so 22 years later, what's happening is there's been a couple other, the two main studies that I'm aware of that have changed but there may be others too. I haven't been as up on the research as I was when I wrote the book, but there's this one study called KEEPS and one study called ELITE, and I forget what the letters stand for. But the upshot of those two are that actually if women take HRT, and by HRT, they're meaning, and I'm meaning in this conversation, synthetic hormone replacement therapy, that the benefits outweigh the risk if they take it in as close to actually the symptoms in perimenopause and menopause as you can get. So for 5 years, right around there. And they're saying that it's if you start taking it later, or if you're taking it later, that you're really going to have the side effects that 2002 NIH study showed. So everybody's excited about this because that means, oh, good, you can take it for 5 years now. The benefits will outweigh the risks. And women are thrilled because no question about it, it takes away hot flashes and night sweats and insomnia and those mood swings for a lot of women. So there's no question about it. And so that's the sort of clear message coming from the Western community right now, the Western scientific community and medical community. That's the clear message, and women are thrilled about it. And you've probably had those conversations, and understandably so, because like I said, it works on those symptoms. Not all the time, but almost all the time. It works really well for those symptoms. So take a breath there. And before I say my feelings about it, I want to preface my feelings about it by saying, first of all, they're my feelings about it now. They might change, but I sort of doubt it because they haven't changed in 25 years. But I'll, who knows? So, but the other thing that I will say is I get really suspicious of anybody who's really confident about what all this means and what everybody should do. I don't feel that way. And from what I can see, there is not a clear black and white answer here. So let me tell you my concerns, I guess, with this point of view, this current point of view. One is that before 2002 study, I was in practice at that time. And before that time, this was the kind of language that was being used is, oh, the studies are clear. Hormone therapy, hormone replacement therapy, it protects your heart and it protects your bones. And it does protect your bones a little bit, but there's other things that do that too. It protects your heart, and it's really a physiological necessity. We need this level of estrogen, and the science is clear. I mean, I heard that kind of stuff, and it turns out it wasn't true for at least in a certain age bracket for a certain time, kind of thing. It wasn't true. And we were taught kind of that we weren't being effective, responsible physicians if we didn't offer this because it helped women. And now it feels a very similar kind of messaging, like, oh, now the science is clear. Now the science is clear. Now we know this is, and if you don't give your patients this, then you're an irresponsible physician. You're letting your belief systems get in the way of science. That's kind of the unspoken or spoken sort of message that I'm hearing. And I'm not a Western researcher. So I can't analyze all this research well enough to really pick out the weak points and the strong points and the clarity. But when I read it all, it's not black and white as who should take it and who shouldn't and for how long and when. Figuring that out, really difficult. Like in Menopause Chronicles, we just had yesterday Dr. Avanti Kumar Singh come on and talk about her. She's a Western medical doctor and an Ayurvedic practitioner, and she just went through breast cancer, and her tumor was estrogen positive. And she was talking about, now HRT is off the table for her, right? As for so many women with, breast cancer, it's off the table. Now, this is because it's known that synthetic estrogen increases the chance of breast cancer, right? So you could say, well, you could look at your family history and your markers, of which Dr. Avanti said she had none. She had no family history and no genetic she didn't have the risk factors for it. So I want to just take her as an example. If she had sat down with her endocrinologist or practitioner and said, I think I want to get on HRT. I have no risk factors for breast cancer. And she got on HRT, that would have been bad for her because she did get breast cancer. And predicting whether or not we're going to get breast cancer is tricky business because I don't know if the statistics have changed since I wrote Balance Your Hormones, Balance Your Life. And I don't remember the statistic exactly, but it was something like it's in the book, but all the risk factors for getting breast cancer, if you take them all together, they explain only about, I don't know, 30% of breast cancer, I forget, or 50%. It's not huge. It's very difficult to guess whether we're going to get that or not. So there is risk. There's still a risk. And so it's like, for whom? Is this going to help? Who shouldn't take it? Who should take it? It's a difficult thing. That's just one example of how difficult it is to determine, is it worth the risks, even the little risks for this? That's one of the things. Another thing that, like I said, I'm not a Western researcher, so I can't analyze this research as well as I wish I could. I don't have the eyes and the background to do that. But what occurs to me is that the KEEP study was under 1,000 women. The ELITE study was under 1,000 women. The Women's Health Initiative study was 160,000 women. There's never been another study like that. That was huge. So there's things I might be missing, but my suspicions are, okay, there's the little conspiracy theory side of me that is, I don't lean towards those, but might sound like that, but it's just a fact that there's an enormous financial interest for women to be on these things. For those companies that were making them in 2002, when all of a sudden the rug was pulled out from under them, imagine what that did to their bottom line, right? And imagine how much motivation they have to figure out some way to use these drugs and some period of time. Like, okay, women can't be on them for the rest of their lives, but what if every woman was told that they could be on them and should be on them for 5 years right around menopause? That's a big bump to their bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of incentive to do that. And we know how these studies, either through their question or their testing models, or their model of their experiment models, I don't know how to put it, the design of the test can be flawed, and the underlying question can be flawed in order to get a certain outcome. So I have that sort of, I think, healthy suspicion, or looking at it with a critical eye, not swallowing it all, because of what we were told before 2002 and what we're being told, what the messaging is now. So I still feel that I would probably not ever recommend hormone replacement therapy to anyone, because I've seen women with breast cancer. I've seen women with strokes. I've seen this, and maybe they're small risks, but if you get it, it's not small, right? It's not a small thing. So I don't like putting people in that position. I still would prefer probably to see bioidentical hormones used as a stopgap measure. I think that there are times where that's important. The thing that I find is like the night sweats, the hot flashes, the insomnia, these kinds of things, I feel these are the things that lifestyle and diet and breathing exercises and herbs help enormously with, but they might not help immediately because somebody's background might have been, a poor lifestyle, a poor diet for a long time. Then they need this kind of stopgap measure. But these aren't life-threatening symptoms. They definitely change but what is sort of could be argued to be life-threatening is that they cause so much stress that that's life-threatening in the long run. So there is probably a time, I think, for this stopgap measure. But personally, I would rather see bioidentical hormones being used than hormone replacement therapy. However, that's not always available to everybody. People may not have a compound pharmacy right there. And so the risk of the hormone replacement therapy might actually be worth it for somebody if that's not available to them, if they can't find a good source of the bioidenticals and they can't find someone who knows how to prescribe them and work with them with that. If they can't find that, HRT is readily accessible to everybody. So I guess that's the place where it would maybe be worth the risk because that's what's available to somebody, and those not life-threatening symptoms are so stressful and damaging that the stress and the damage from the sleepless nights, that does become life-threatening. And therefore, that might be a good medicine at that point.
I appreciate you taking the time to share that view with us, which comes from your years of clinical experience. And also it's not your first rodeo with this topic. You've been observing this for decades now. So I find that really helpful because I think a lot of us are in the throes of a very loud conversation right now in the online space. And
I could be wrong, Kate.
Right. And I heard you say this. Yep. Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important that you led with that, to say that when we hear anyone say, yes, this is the answer, that we might want to be skeptical and look deeper at that point.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I immediately get suspicious if somebody is is really confident about this because
yeah.
I'm again not a Western scientist, but I have been looking at this stuff for literally decades, and it's a mess. It's like you could argue anything you wanted, it seems. So I do think that 5 years, if you take them short amount of time, that's when you take them. That I do think that's useful information to have, but the whole thing feels to me pretty unclear.
Yeah, it's so satisfying for me to hear you share that with this community who's listening. So I thank you so much for that. One of the things we talked about today that I talk about in my book, you talk about in your book, you talk about a lot, is the effect of stress on hormones. And something that has surprised me in my journey into this, let's say, late 40s is how much fear of death is a stressor at this stage of life. As our bodies undergo these like very clear physical changes, it has me thinking about death and dying. And that surprised me. Also, as I told you before we press record, my parents, I'm watching my aging parents as well. So I think it's a time of life thing as well, right? A lot of us, we talk about the sort of sandwich generation, women who are raising children and caring for elderly parents at the same time. I mean, talk about stress. Yeah, it's kind of coming from both sides. So it's interesting to me as I'm looking at what your work is right now. You have the Menopause Chronicles, which is a fantastic opportunity for women who want to be in community and talking about all the sorts of things we're hearing from you. We'll put that in the show notes, but you're also offering a course this fall on death and dying, which it seems to be no coincidence that the two are coming through at a similar time. And so I want to ask you, as someone who's further along the path, you're further towards death than I am. Maybe, we don't know, right? But maybe you've got 10 years on me there. And as I was thinking, what I really wanted to ask Claudia is, about like how she feels about this, how you're observing this death and dying process. And then I was thinking that a few years ago, I was on a podcast where we talked about death and dying, and the podcast got canceled. So I'm thinking it's such a taboo. So in the same way that I feel driven to talk about women's health, and talk about our sort of, embarrassing symptoms and such, and periods and tampons, all that sort of stuff. I want to talk about it. I want everyone talking about it. I feel the same way about dying. And I do wonder, in some ways, is part of our difficulty in this stage of life having to do with a fear that comes up as we notice, the dying process is starting to show us these signs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if this is about every stage of life and how fear of death manifests at every stage of life, and what are the unconscious parts and what are the conscious parts of the fear of death. Remember when it was, I think 1992 or 3, and I had been living in India for a year, and I had gone there planning to do a BAMS and be there for 6 years. And I got hepatitis A, which, from contaminated food or water or something somewhere. And I went to the doctor there, the Western MD in Delhi, and it was the worst case of hepatitis A he had ever seen. My liver enzymes were so elevated, and bilirubin was so elevated, and all that kind of stuff. And I was in a hospital, and I had to leave because my visa was running out. And I was 23, 24, something like that. My visa was running out, so I had to go back to the States, and I couldn't do what I needed to do to stay there to get into a BAMS because my visa was running out and I couldn't get the student visa. So all this stuff came down, and the day I could walk across a room was the day I had to get on a plane and come home. And that day, a friend of mine who was with me, took me in a rickshaw to this Ayurvedic pharmacy, and I got some medicines to bring back with me. And my liver was achy, and I'm going on this bumpy rickshaw on this bumpy road, and it's bumping my liver, and I'm like, am I gonna die? And I had always thought I wasn't afraid of death. And at that moment, when it really felt like, okay, this is possible, I didn't want to. And it was so long ago, I can't remember if I was afraid of dying or I just didn't want to or what that was, but it was a come to Jesus meeting kind of moment for me. Like, okay, I have thought that I was not afraid of death, but when it stared me in the face, I didn't feel ready for it. And reminds me of this story that my guru used to tell, where there's this older woman and her daughter is sick, and maybe very sick, and has been for a while. And every day the mother would pray to God, God, please take her, take me, don't take her, let her live. I'm an old lady, take me, don't take her. Every day she would pray for this. And then she went out this one morning to get milk, and the cow had gotten its head stuck in the bucket and was like charging around and making quite a racket with the head in the bucket. And she thought it was the Lord of Death. And she said, oh, Lord, take her. Hey, don't take me. She's sick anyway. Take my daughter. She's sick anyway. People couldn't do without me. And so I think, I had that moment in the rickshaw where I was like, oh no, take somebody else. Don't take me. It made me realize, I don't know that I can assess whether or not I'm afraid of death, because it's this illusion to me, right? I feel like I'm not afraid of death, but it's not staring me in the face in a way that tests me really, at the moment. And when it did, when I was 23, I failed that test. I didn't want to go. I wasn't ready. So I don't know how afraid I am of death, or maybe this is a universal experience. I mean, Yudhishthira, one of the 5 Pandava brothers, when he was in the forest, this yaksha, this spirit, he was being tested. And the spirit gave him a bunch of questions and he answered them all correctly. And one of the questions was, what's the most astounding thing in life? And Yudhishthira answered correctly. The most astounding thing in life is that we carry our friends and our relatives to the graveyard and we never think it's going to happen to us. So, I'm that person. I was that person in the rickshaw, like thinking, oh, I'm not afraid of death. I'm not afraid of death. Here it is. Oh, I don't want to go. No, thanks. So I don't know that I have the awareness even of myself to know how afraid I am of death. But because, there's this kind of illusion that maybe we have to live in order to put one foot in front of the other the way we do in life. But I do feel that facing death, trying to discover what is meant by learning to die daily. A number of the, religions and spiritual traditions we have say, die daily. Or Christ says, I take up the cross daily. Die daily. I think that it's something to practice for me. My husband some years ago had a heart attack and all his brothers he was one of four brothers. Both his parents had had heart attacks. All his brothers had had heart attacks, even his one who's younger than him. So we kind of knew it would happen at some point. We kind of figured his previous lifestyle and diet hadn't been great for his heart and so forth. So he had his heart attack and we're in the emergency room and he had to be transferred to a different hospital because the podunk hospital that we're near couldn't handle doing a stent kind of thing. So he was going to be transferred and I had to drive it, I couldn't go up in the hot ambulance with him. So I'm in the waiting room. I don't know if he's going to be okay, but I think he's at that moment, right? But I had a feeling he'd probably be okay. All his brothers got through this. His parents didn't die of heart attacks ultimately. He was young, he was strong, he was in good shape. He was probably going to be okay. But I didn't know. And I know how elusive it is to really feel like, okay, death is in front of me now. I wanted to take advantage of that moment where I didn't know if he was going to make it and digest that, kind of pre-digest his death. Because if we live out normal lifespans, which there's no guarantee of, but if we do, I'm going to have time without him. And I wanted to digest it. And so I just sat there to digest it. And this nurse came out and she said, I want to tell you, I think he's going to be okay. And I said, I think he is too, but I want to take advantage of this moment to digest the time when he's not going to be okay, or I'm not going to be okay. So these moments that we have where we really do get to come face to face with mortality in a way that our essence is open to believing, really. I think those are powerful practice moments. And, my husband and I have at different points in our lives had to move a lot and stay with, for there was a period of our lives, a year and a half or so, where we didn't have a home base. We were staying with friends and family, and we would have to leave the little kids and leave the family. And each one of them, we would look to each other and say, it's a practice death, and just relinquishing. And I think that, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question here at all, but all of this attention to that there's a end to all of this doing that we're going to do, that we are going to go, to put ourselves in the way of those moments, to being open to those moments, to digesting those moments. I think that it has sort of this alchemical ability to transform us and prepare us for that, and which makes us live differently now. And that making us live differently, because hormones don't change in a vacuum, they change in relation to our experiences and our life, our diets, our thoughts, our emotions, our outlooks, because they reflect these inner changes, not the other way around. These inner changes that we have when we acclimate to the reality of our leaving this place, they're going to have an effect on the hormones. And little by little, if we work on digesting it, I think that digests the fear too. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
it has me feeling how digesting death it's been part of my process recently in the past couple of years. And I think it has to do with aging. You noticing aging in physical ways, in my body, and digestion versus avoidance, and what a difference that makes in how, not only in our moment of death, but in how we live now. I feel that culturally we're like, it's like we put the blinder on and pretend we're not dying, you know, and then we end up sweating the small stuff all the time, where there's actually this like sort of large digestion processes that can go on, where like I've been becoming open to allowing parts of my life to die, like professionally or, personally, family stuff, like allowing, beginning to digest and accept that, oh, my father won't be here much longer. Or maybe I'm not going to keep working so hard for much longer. And I'm allowing those things to like come through and I feel them. And I think when you say digest, that's what you mean, right? To sort of allow things to come through and be present and spend some time feeling that.
yeah, what I mean by digest is not push it away. These precious moments where we really do feel that mortality as real, to open up and let the Mack truck hit me, and let it go through. Let it absorb, let it rearrange me in the way that I need to be rearranged, And there's when you said professionally, I think that that's a huge part of what we can do during the grahasta period of life, the householder period of life that's busy, where you're writing, you're working, you're getting your degrees, you're doing your profession, all this stuff. We have to be willing to sacrifice everything for nothing, because ultimately this accepting that I'm nothing. I mean, on one hand, there's this story of this Sufi who, in one pocket, he has a note that says, I'm a child of God and this universe was created for my sake alone. And in the other hand, it says, I am nothing but dust and ashes. And he pulls out one when he needs that message. And from a certain perspective, I'm nothing. I'm nothing. I'm part of nothing. And sacrificing the books and the teaching and the relationships, all of these things, being willing to sacrifice all of it for nothing. What does that bring us? That, to me, is a way to sort of begin to digest mortality. It's connected because it is a death. It's a death of something that I'm attached to or potentially attached to. So being willing to sacrifice my head, that part of my head anyway, right? And see, what am I without that? Relinquished to the nothing.
Right. Which I just want to restate for our friends listening. It sounds like you're not saying it's the nothingness that's the point. It's the willingness to allow for space in life.
I don't know. I know that it feels sometimes to me when I'm really letting go of something and nothing seems to be in the place. Like if I let go of something, then there's this nothingness there. And that can be scary. And that can feel like a void. And that can feel empty. And there's something about that that I trust. It yields something, but it's not coming from my will. I don't just mean like give yourself enough space to have a cup of tea and put your feet up. That's important, but this is a little different.
I love this conversation. I want to also point listeners that you're having this course coming up soon. We'll put in the show notes on death and dying, because that is, I think we're just like scratching the surface of something that might leave people with more questions. So I want to point people towards that as a place to kind of keep learning skills like these and bringing conversations like this into our lives. I think that's like my goal in having a podcast like this, is just to talk about things like this. Hopefully we don't get canceled and removed from the space for talking about dying. And also reminding folks that you do have a community online around menopause called Menopause Chronicles, which is ongoing, right? People can join that now or at any time.
Correct.
Fantastic. Thanks for offering that and being in the space. I'm so grateful to share you with everyone who's listening. And is there anything else, last thoughts before we go you want to share?
I think not for the moment. Just thank you, and thanks everybody for being here, and it's going to be okay.
Thank you.